It's our job every time to try to fight back. It's just exhausting. We don't always want to do that. But if a social group that you're participating in is important to you, it's something that has to happen. You know, if you don't feel comfortable saying certain things, that's not an actual meaningful dialogue.
This is a video for anti-government students who are interested in maintaining club harmony through community efforts. I would like the Liberty movement to be as inclusive as possible. However, an unfortunate trend is many women do not participate in political clubs and on other organizations. Leadership ought to be aware of harmful behavior that causes unnecessary exclusion. Here to discuss the discord between genders is Beth Payne.
The majority of my experiences come from being women in group organizations, and some of those organizations were areas where I felt like I was really facilitating being able to speak from my experience, to call attention to things that made it more difficult for other women to participate. And then some of those groups are not good at facilitating that. One of the things that is difficult to recognize is oppression that doesn't directly impact you. But the hardest thing to fight is oppression that directly impacts you. There's a sense of it's easier to go with the flow of a specific social organization, or to go with the context that the group is already engaging in, than to be the only person who fights back against it and to basically ostracize yourself. And so a lot of times an environment where it doesn't feel like you can speak out, or draw attention to things that you feel like are personally injurious to yourself, you just internalize them. And a lot of times what happens then is that, people that are feeling that kind of exclusion from the conversation, women, queers, people of color, just kind of give up on trying to bring that fight up over and over again and just migrate away. And so, people tend to look at it like we're asking for like quotas to be filled within groups, and that doesn't make any sense. That's tokenization. It's more of, if you take a look at a healthy group, you're probably going to see representation of different groups, because it's a healthy group because all those people feel like they can engage and have the part of the conversation. If you don't see a lot of representation of different groups, then the first question you should ask is there a reason that people don't feel comfortable joining this group or engaging in the conversation? What I really appreciate about the groups that I engage with, and in particular the men that I engage with, is that they are really open to criticism. And that's not an easy thing for any of us. It's important that I myself am also really open to criticism, and that I'm able to hear when people are calling me out. But I think that I genuinely feel for like white males, because they really don't have a context to compare and to understand like forms of oppression, where women tend to understand racism a little better because we experience sexism. People of color tend to understand sexism better because they experience racism. White males really genuinely do have an uphill battle where they have to learn to recognize it without any context. And that is not an easy thing to do. And I think it's completely understandable that it's harder for them. The guys that I work with have been really, really good about listening and paying attention and elevating the women that they work with, and responding when they get called out, and actually listening and hearing it out. And I think that the most important thing is that we all determine the way that we take criticism. Not all criticism is valid, obviously, but if we dismiss all criticism as invalid, then we can never grow as people. And the sooner that we start to take it in and think, let me parse this and understand where this person's coming from and question whether this actually applies to me, the more we grow and are able to really develop some integrity in the way that we're engaging with people. I think one of the most important things is that you have to push back that internalization and start to call out behaviors and start to identify like, hey, when you say that, this is how it comes across. The other thing is that when we don't say something, we're essentially creating a safe space for that behavior. It's similar to a very common behavior among white people, is that white people are generally socialized around other white people. And there's a lot of like very low-level racist jokes made in groups that are only white that would not be made if there was a person of color standing there. And often there's people standing there that think that that joke isn't funny, they don't like that context, but they don't say anything. And it creates a safe place for that kind of racism to perpetuate. If we wait around for our friends that are people of color to invade those spaces, call out those behaviors, and defend themselves, then we're doing them a huge disservice. I think that some of the main obstacles are that women and men are all really socialized in our society to view specific roles and behaviors. Women in general are often cast in a light that is emotional, naive, sensitive. All of those things, crazy is a word that we hear a lot. All of those things really undermine our ability to communicate how we feel. And what it becomes is an extra barrier in communication where we have to defend ourselves first against those criticisms before we're even allowed to explain where we're coming from. Men do not have that same obstacle. They do not have to defend themselves from being crazy. Those preconceptions of women as being, naive, emotional, sensitive, etc., what they really do is they undermine our ability to engage in any kind of higher level conversation. If there's a predetermination that we should be dismissed and that we do not understand what we're talking about or we don't have legitimate context, then why would anybody take us seriously? And it's up to both women and men to identify that when that is happening and to fight back against it. And that can be a very difficult thing to do because we really literally have been steeped in it in our entire lives. Those are the kind of little microaggressions that we don't fight back against, right? I mean, how many times has somebody made a comment around you like, oh, that person must be on their time a month or whatever, and you just do not have the energy to fight every single person that says that around you. Sometimes you do, and a lot of times you don't. And we just let so many things go because we can. Another thing that with conflict resolution is that in general, a lot of conflicts are resolved in a way that is really like hypermasculine and aggressive. It tends to be that whoever's the loudest determines the outcome, or at least makes it so that other people don't feel as comfortable engaging. There are lots of ways to engage in conflict resolution in small groups, and there's ways to engage in conflict resolution with like large power structures. In a small group, the most important thing is that people have to be willing to sit down and actually talk about what is going wrong. If somebody is drawing to the group's attention, this person is engaging in this behavior, they're consistently talking over me, they're consistently talking down to me, they're, creating a situation where I don't feel comfortable engaging and I also feel like that's probably affecting other members of the group, then you have to actually call upon that person to answer for that. And I think that that's an interesting one to bring up, is like there tends to be, in particular I would say with liberty groups, a context that elevates all ideologies, all ideas as meaningful on the same level. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think that that context has to exist. I don't think that we should say racism is equally acceptable. It isn't. Sexism is not equally acceptable. It isn't about imposing your ideas on other people when you tell somebody that they can't engage in a racist or sexist way. It's about they are now imposing their ideas on others. They are actually actively undercutting people in your group. And so instead of defining that as you're asking this person to alter their beliefs for the rest of the group, they have already crossed that line. They are asking everybody else to accept that they are going to treat people as less than them. And I don't think that's where they're crossing the boundary of somebody else's personal liberty. But it isn't viewed that way very frequently. That is them actually crossing other people's boundaries. So if you call out that behavior and people stand by it, then they have identified that they're not going to participate in your community. It goes back to the same context. They are actively going to undermine people's ability to participate, and there's no political group that can grow if it doesn't have all perspectives being fed into it. Mm-hmm. As we slowly whittle away the people that are engaging, then we are limiting the actual real world context in which we're discussing ideas. Okay. If it's missing a female perspective, a queer perspective, the perspective of people experiencing, different kinds of racism because there's different racial castes, how do we even know that these ideas work or are applicable or mean anything outside of that room? And so for the strength of any political group to actually apply their ideas and be able to expand their theory, they need to have all those perspectives being fed in, and they need to be able to engage in them, and they need to have conflict and challenges and work through them. And they need, and especially in a personal liberty context, you'd have to have the ability to present your ideas in a way that isn't infringing on anybody else's ability to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that seems to be like a constant struggle with liberty groups. So a sexually aggressive person, we tend to put things in really simplified terms. So we tend to think of somebody who's sexually aggressive as being like a rapist, you know? And we also tend to think of a rapist as like a scary person in a back alley with like a knife and a trench coat or something, yeah, and a mustache. But like, really though, our socialization makes it really easy to rape people, like incredibly easy. There's so many contexts where a female doesn't have that much of a say or doesn't feel like she can take the social risk that is necessary to say no. We see it in varying degrees in different age groups. Like, for instance, in high school, you know, if the captain of the football team comes on to you, how comfortable do you feel rejecting him? Do you feel like it's necessary for you to parse that this person is considered, you know, the pinnacle of social achievement, so there's not a good reason for you to reject him? Those kind of constructs exist and perpetuate in lots of different forms of society. And, you know, they're really super evident in, like, the Greek organizations within colleges. Mm-hmm. The way that the you know, sororities and fraternities are paired off, and essentially, like, this is the fraternity that you are supposed to associate with. This is the sorority you're supposed to associate with. That is...
And sororities encourage, basically coitus.
Yes, exactly. That's presented differently to the sorority than it is to the fraternity, right? The fraternity has free range. They can sleep with anybody and everybody they want, but the sorority is essentially supposed to be catering to that fraternity and building them up. Right? Building up their egos, building up their, you know, male conquests.
Mm-hmm. It's not a good party without girls.
Exactly. And what is your context at the party as a girl? You better be fun. You better be, you know, you better not be challenging them on anything. You better be lighthearted and ditzy and have fun and make sure that they are having fun. That idea that it becomes like literally like a brothel situation. Women are supposed to both be able to party hard with the guys, right? Have fun, don't not be fun, right? Ever. But they're also expected to be able to meaningfully defend themselves.
Smile.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You smile. Strangers tell you all the time to smile, right? Weird old men tell you to smile, get angry at you if you held the door open for them. Like, strange context that they're constantly reinforcing that, like, women are supposed to be, you know, how dare you undo my chivalry? You know? Like, obviously, it's very meaningful if you didn't engage in it. Like, that doesn't even make any sense. But that concept that women are, you know, like we were talking about makeup, you know, mm-hmm. like the reason we wear makeup is to present ourselves better. The reason that we spend a lot of time and money on clothes and hair and all of these things is to present ourselves better. It's interesting because actually one of the guys at the SFL club brought up the construct of He-Man. You know, and said, why isn't He-Man viewed as just as bad as Barbie? I think He-Man is just as bad as Barbie. I think G.I. Joe is just as bad as Barbie. I think all of these, like, super muscular, you know, I solve all my problems with violence, you know, I raid the castle and rescue the princess and carry her over my shoulder out of the castle. Those are all really negative, horrible stereotypes. And when I pointed out that was part of the construct of sexism, you know, he was like, you can't just use that as this panacea. It doesn't apply to everything, but it absolutely applies to gender role stereotyping. This masculine, feminine spectrum that we're presented with is not binary. It's not you're this or you're this. You know, all sorts of people exist across all over on that spectrum. I grew up as a tomboy. Tomboy is even a term that I am not a big fan of because it's intentionally drawing attention to a boyish girl, allegedly. I'm fully anti-state, and I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is that if we are anti-state, we have to present how we would live in a situation where there wasn't a state. We cannot exist in a society with no state if there is no consequence to any behavior. Consequences have to then come from and be reinforced by the community. They have to come from individuals instead of from a state. If we do not figure out what behaviors have consequences and figure out what the adequate response to those would be that would hold people accountable and make those behaviors go away, we can't actually present ourselves as anti-state because we don't have a solution. We can't say, take away the state and everything will be fine if we ourselves can't live that way. So when we say, this behavior is directly hurting an entire community of people and it's making it so they aren't participating and they aren't able to be part of the discussion, we have to assign some kind of accountability for that and we have to follow up with it. We have to figure out how to fix it. Because if not, we're essentially saying we cannot fix our own problems and we're almost making an argument for statists. There are lots of things that are societal that are not enforced by laws already. We don't have laws that say that that Black people should only be presented in media as thugs or as entertainers. We don't have that as a law, but that is a societal construct. As long as that exists, it is actively, affecting people's opportunities and their ability to engage. And I know that that is a huge part of any free market ideology, is that everybody is able to engage in an equal level. So if we don't dismantle those kind of constructs, then we actually are not engaging on an equal level. So, if we don't dismantle the construct that women are, naive and emotional and sensitive and unable to participate in a meaningful way, then that market doesn't exist. The exchange of ideas doesn't exist. When people give up social power, it feels like oppression. We
can use men's rights activists.
Yeah, men's rights activists is a great idea. Is a great version of that. Is that they feel like they're being oppressed because their specific behaviors are being called out, and it is understandable that if the behaviors that you engage in are being identified as negative, and you're going to get defensive, but there has to be an ability to step outside of it, and that's not easy to do. But when we step outside of it and we see that imbalance of power that already exists, then we'd understand that to elevate these other groups, the group that's on top has to give things up. The dominant paradigm has to give things up. I'm in a dominant paradigm that is white. I absolutely recognize that I get treated differently by police officers, that I get treated differently by teachers, that I get treated differently by strangers. Small example, I went to the movies yesterday. This guy walked up to us and said, "Hey, I have a ticket for free popcorn that we're not going to use. Do you want it?" And we were like, "Hell yeah, we want free popcorn." But as he walked away, my partner said, "We're the only white couple in line." And he was a white guy. There's so many weird little things that we engage in, the way that we engage, that we don't even recognize that we're doing. And, that privilege is not something that we necessarily engage with consciously or choose. We just are used to being the dominant paradigm, and it becomes really uncomfortable to stand back and look at that, right? Like I want free popcorn. I want to get out of traffic tickets, and then the other side of that is that the times that we don't get out of a traffic ticket, do we feel like we were treated the same way as another group, and hence the privilege doesn't exist? It's not necessarily true. The easiest way to dismantle these things is to actually just go back to the science on it. It's really easy to look at statistics and see the differences between the way people are treated based on their race or their gender, perceptions of their gender. I grew up in hardcore music. That's a totally specific subculture, but it's extremely male dominated. And for a lot of reasons that I think are really interesting, because there's a lot of social power attributed to violence. So if you attribute social power to violence, then typically the bigger people are going to get more social power, as are the people that can form a larger majority, right? So it becomes very white, male dominated. Through that, women become really trivialized. Women are girlfriends. They aren't really in it for the music. They're there to get a boyfriend. Really terrible role stereotyping. And one of the things that was really interesting was that originally in that context, I participated in it because I felt like, well, I just had to prove myself. I had to be one of the guys. Those are the two roles you can get in hardcore girls, is you can be one of the guys or you can be a girlfriend, or, a slut essentially is what the girlfriend role is. You're there for sex or you are one of the guys. There's so many better things to aspire to than to be one of the guys, because in that context that essentially means that like being a man is better and you should try to be more like them. But when I was young and first got into it, then that was what I did. I fought against, that I was going to always be one of the guys. I was going to be just as, aggressive as they were or just as involved as they were. And part of that was undercutting other females, maybe not consciously, but that was how you establish that. And then as I got older, I was so like ashamed of my participation in that kind of system. And a lot of females migrate away from hardcore because of that. But then I felt like there's a responsibility there to go back to that with the amount of social power that you've accrued and dismantle it. There have been some really amazing females in the Arizona hardcore scene that have come together recently and had conversations about the sexism in hardcore. I'm not a huge fan of the term ally because in general it tends to be presented in a really liberal context that is like an ally is somebody who's supposed to stand back and ensure that the oppressed are having a voice. I think that that's a great first step, but it can't be the end of it, because otherwise then like our silence and inaction is complicit with like the dominant paradigm. There's nothing different between me standing back and not saying anything about racism and somebody else who is actually not trying to dismantle racism, not saying something about racism. So yes, make sure that people that are oppressed are getting a chance to talk and that they're not being spoken over or, derailed or dismissed, but then also stand up and say something yourself. In particular in environments where maybe those people are not being able to participate to begin with, or they're not even present. There's a really good zine that was put out by some local peeps that I definitely would recommend people check out, called Accomplices, Not Allies. And the idea is that an ally is somebody who is saying that they want to see, the liberation of other groups, but they're not actually doing anything about it. And an accomplice is somebody who's fighting alongside them. We do away with that ally model of like standing by and just allowing people to speak up and defend themselves, because that's exhausting and it's unnecessary. And it's also not really fair to put it all upon them to deconstruct what is oppressing them. As a white person, it's on me to deconstruct racism. It's on me to attack that where I see it and call it out, especially in groups of all white people where it tends to be created some type of safe place for some level of racism. Men have to engage to dismantle sexism. And the best ways that they can do that is to start to recognize what the behaviors are that perpetuate it. Men talking over women, men interrupting women, the terms that are used to dismiss the ideas of women as naive or emotional or sensitive. Those terms, when those terms come up, then men have to be able to recognize them and call them out for what they are. And also, they have to be willing to engage in some kind of accountability methods. If somebody calls you out on your behavior, you have to be able to step back and pay attention to it and question whether that criticism applies to you or not. And be willing to engage on that and ask questions and, and say, well, I don't feel like I'm engaging in that, or, can you give me examples of how I'm engaging in that? But be open to hearing what is said to you. If we let go of some of our defensiveness, we grow as people. And in a group setting, that's especially important, because especially any club that is predominantly male, there's going to be a tendency to fall into, you know, the way the socialization of males and the way that men talk over everybody and you know, dismiss the outside ideas. Men have to be the ones that engage and dismantle that. Women standing up and you know, speaking out and calling it out for what it is really important, but they can't, shouldn't only have to be a certain type of female to be able to carve out a space where you're free to talk. You shouldn't have to be a really in-your-face, brash, outspoken, loud female to be able to participate in the conversation. All females should be able to participate in the conversation. People of color, people from different religious backgrounds, people from different cultural backgrounds, people with limited English skills should all be able to participate in the conversation, because without those perspectives, our ideas mean nothing. If they are only applicable to the things we've already experienced in life and the perspectives are the only ones we've ever experienced, they don't actually mean anything. They have to be able to be tested in real world circumstances. And that includes involving people from, you know, lives and perspectives that we have never led. So for men to become less of allies and more of like accomplices in dismantling sexism, they have to actively engage in it. They have to actively take part in being able to talk to other men about it, being able to say, hey, actually, you know, she's trying to talk and you keep interrupting her, and I really want to make sure she gets a chance to talk. I've even seen, you know, where guys will say, I haven't heard any females engage on this question. You know, can we just take a second and see if anybody had an answer that they were waiting to say? Or, you know, it could be much more subtle than that, to like turn to a female member of the group and say, you know, what do you think about this? Mm-hmm. And make sure that that person is actually allowed the opportunity to talk. The more there's an encouragement of including other perspectives as a positive thing, that goes a really long way. If any of us could sit in an echo chamber and feel like we are right about everything, you know, none of us benefit from that though, because we walk out of that room and we're back in the real world where there's, you know, a bombardment of different ideas and philosophies and experiences. Our ideas have to be able to survive that as well. Mm-hmm. I think that it's important that, again, like, we're not looking for quotas. If you're looking at quotas, you're tokenizing people. If you're like, yes, that black kid joined our club, obviously we're not racist, then you're asking that black kid to represent like an entire race, which they, I'm sure, do not want to do. And we all are living with internalized sexism and racism and things in our lives already. So, you know, if I join a club and then I'm treated as a representative of all females, that's an enormous burden for me to carry. I'm not going to be able to speak for the perspectives of all females, nor should anybody. And what really needs to happen is that club space needs to feel like a safe environment for lots of women to join, and they should be able to argue with me. You know, we should be able to hash out the differences in our perspectives. If I am the token female, then, and my point of view represents all females, I could be dealing with a lot of internalized sexism and justifying behaviors that are actually working against me and other members of my gender. You know, that's not how it should work. If you're a club leader, I think that it's especially important for you to take a look at the demographics of your club and question why you're not seeing more people participate from other groups. And you can't go recruiting them, because that's tokenization as well. But what you should do is start to recognize, you know, when somebody new comes to the club, do they stay? If they don't stay, what are the reasons that they might have left? You know, and there are specific phrases and things that are said that if they are racist or sexist, you need to call them out, and you need to ask people to be able to defend their ideas without that. Mm-hmm. If you can't defend your ideas without resorting to racism or sexism or, you know, outdated, you know, hierarchies like that, then your ideas are not very strong on their own. And they, again, are only going to exist within a certain population. It is also making your club members stronger to be able to defend their ideas without that. So call it out. Hey, you know, we are an anti-racist club. And, you know, if you're going to make comments along the lines that you are a proud racist, you know, and that this is why, and you believe in some type of, you know, biological determinism, then this is not the place for you to talk about that, because we actually, you know, we're trying to advocate for ideas based in science. Same thing with sexism. It's harder for us to recognize again because, again, it is more subtly ingrained in us. But if you're really taking a look at it and you're seeing that the women are consistently shouted down or consistently being told really negative messaging, such as the first meeting that I went to of SFL, where I was told that women benefit from the commodification of marriage. That's pretty extreme. That's not a small idea to be perpetuating, and when I pointed out that that was misogynist, there was a defense made for that person being able to have that viewpoint. All viewpoints do not have to be tolerated. I am not a tolerant person because I don't see any reason to tolerate hate. And I'm not going to tolerate people being oppressed. The idea of tolerance, I think, is really misused. It goes along with that idea of allyship, that all voices are equal and all ideas should be tolerated. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be heard. I want to be respected. I want to actually be listened to. I do not want to be tolerated. So I'm not going to allow somebody else to be undercutting other females around me and making it so that they are being, told that they are a property and that they benefit from being commodified. We have to fight back about those kind of ideas. If in the liberty movement, with there being a tendency to define everything in economic terms or terms of law versus not a law, there's a lot of open space that's being left for social issues. Consequences are as much a part in social interactions as they are in market exchanges. We have to stop and look at what things are not necessarily definable as a market exchange or a legal, restriction, but are still behaviors that deserve consequences.